Everyone, this is a great honor. I want to present to you someone who I grew up loving since I was a 13-year-old boy, did not know who he was at the time, just knew he was one of the greatest writer artists in the industry. I started reading his American Flag at 14, which might explain a lot. Thought what he did with the shadow was so awesome. It was so out of this world. Never have I read a story where the main character does not appear in the entire issue. And then he finally appears on the last page, and it is just dramatic. It is breathtaking. Uh, we'll talk about how the look on Margot Lane's face, how that affected everything. We're going to talk about how he has one of the most enviable careers in comics that I've ever seen. He's done comics, he's done movies, he's done TV. He is a writer artist. He is one of the greatest, most well respected writer artists this industry has ever had. He's a writer who artists love to work with. He got to work with Jose Garcia Lopez and so many other great creators. And writers just want to work with him, whether it's Brian Michael Bendis, you can name a list. And so before I just keep drooling and talking about this, ladies and gentlemen, Howard Chaykin.
Thanks, Nick. And if half of it was true, I could kill myself right now. You know what I'm saying?
I think more of it's true than you'd
That
like to admit.
you know. Oh, I mean, there are people who like me, but I'm also universally despised. I'm not a walk in the park, and I'm a cult figure and an acquired taste, and I accept that. I long ago gave up on trying to be very serious. If you can't please everybody, you got to please yourself, and I do.
No, I mean, I can understand that. And here's the thing, and I said this in the opening, you have one of the most enviable careers this industry has ever had. And
I don't think that's
you
true. If you believe that, that's fine. I think it's nonsense. I mean, I'm an outlier and a marginal figure. I'm someone who is extremely influential, but is also extremely reviled. Um, I'm not a character and an artist that people think of first. I'm not fan service. I don't do fan service, and fan service is the almost guarantor of success in the comic book business. I am very proud of the work I've done. I'm proud of the career that I've had, at least for 40 to 50 years. And I'm just not convinced I was going to give a shit about these. I used to think I'd get the upper left-hand corner on Wednesday, the New York Times for my obit. I'll be lucky now if I make it in a little square on Tuesday. You know, I'm okay, but I'm not blessed by the kind of universal love that you seem to think I am. But no, not at all.
you and I will disagree on this, so we won't get stuck on it too much.
No,
Um,
sure, I'm willing. Go ahead.
no, I mean, look, here's the thing. You don't have some of the conversations I've had with creators when they talk about you. If there's anything that maybe, as you're saying, people don't like about you, I think it's mostly because you're blunt and you tell people the way it is. You don't sugarcoat stuff. You're just really upfront about.
What I'm talking about. Success in comic books is frequently based on patronizing and pandering to fan service. I mean, one of the things I've come to believe is that the Comic Code Authority in 1954 and 55 not only infantilized comic books, but it also infantilized the audience. It created an audience who were satisfied by looking at the material for its branding and its content as opposed to its form. And I'm more interested in form than content. I believe in providing content of some value, but I believe also that the content we've come down to is for the most part just basically adolescent junk. You know,
Well,
just
for a man who thinks this is adolescent junk, you've written some of the most complex and graphic comics of all time. I mean,
and
look, I said this once
it's
before.
prevail. I mean, it's still the bottom line is I'm still marginal and a cult figure. The work that I do reaches a very specific audience if I reach maybe a quarter at most a quarter, more likely a fifth of the actual audience of comic book enthusiasts in the United States, I'd be surprised at the very most. Trust me on this. And again, none of this is self-deprecation. I know how good I am. This is not. I have deep-seated self-esteem and an enormous self-regard. Trust me. I have an ego.
Okay, so agree to disagree, and if you're reaching 20 to 25% of the fandom, I think you're ahead of a lot of people. So,
come on, there are people who are beloved. I'm not beloved.
Okay, again, we'll move on from this conversation. Now,
remember you invited.
What was that?
I said you invited me to this. Remember that.
That is true. That is true.
As Super Chicken said to Fred, you knew the job was dangerous when you took it.
Yeah, and as I'm thinking, this is Howard Chaykin's revenge on Nick Barrucci by doing this interview. Wait till you see what he does to me.
No. That's not true. Remember, I've watched you eat.
So, by the way, my interviews are far from linear. I'll jump around, timeline, thoughts, everything. So
that's fine.
So you are definitely one of the smartest writers this industry has ever had. And there are things that I've read and things that I've heard. I'm pretty sure a good portion of them are true because they're too unbelievable to be untrue. You were in the DC offices when they were showing people Watchmen, and Dave Gibbons was there, and you turned to him and said, "Hey, good stuff."
No, not true.
Not true. I love these interviews. I get stuff this
No, I was aware of Watchmen a year before it came out. I had dinner with my then wife, Alan and his then wife, and Frank with his then wife, at a now defunct soul food restaurant in Lower Manhattan called the Honey Tree. And Alan was talking about this. This is when it was still they were going to be the Charlton characters. And I moved to California. And before I moved to California, my editor on The Shadow was Andy Helfer, who was also editing Watchmen at the time. And I saw the black and whites of the first issue, and I was blown away. And from that point on, I had the first 3 issues in black and white in my hands before the first issue came out. So I'd read it, and I liked it a great deal. What I didn't realize at the time was how salient, in particular, the first 2 issues, the backup features in issues 1 and 2 were understanding everything that was going on in the front 20 some odd pages. I love the book, but to a great extent, like much of Alan's work, it doesn't really end as much as conclude. It doesn't. There's no real conclusive ending. Alan, as brilliant as a wordsmith as Alan is, he's never really demonstrated an ability to finish a job in a way that serves the circular nature of narrative.
Well, he leaves it open ended. Whether it's killing.
That's not true. I think he just runs out of steam, and that's true of a lot of the stuff that he's done.
Well, and I'll go back to that leaves it open ended, just like the end of Killing Joke, where you didn't know if he killed the Joker or not. Just like Watchmen, you see the big octopus, and then you see Night Owl and oh god, I forget her name. Not. So yeah, you see that.
For all the shit that Zack Snyder takes for the Watchmen movie, I think his restructuring of it to connect Ozymandias with Dr. Manhattan as the menace that unites humanity makes a great deal more structural sense from a narrative perspective than what happened in the comic book. I know that's not going to make me any friends, but that's really the way I see it. And
I agree with you. Sure, it was a lot of following the roadmap that Alan and Dave put together, but you're right. The way he changed it for a mass audience made it make more sense. If he would have did it fully, pound for pound, story beat by story beat, exactly the same way, he really wouldn't have done anything. He made it what it needed to be.
I'm not talking about either the movie or the comic book. I'm talking about from the perspective of narrative, pulling this giant squid out of his ass made less sense than having the conclusion of the narrative tie into the rest of the material. That makes sense because you're telling a story inside an enclosed universe. That's just me. I mean, again, I could be wrong, but I'm rarely wrong.
And when you are, as you said, you'll be the first one to admit it.
Absolutely, because it requires an ego to be able to commit. It just there's a lot of deliciousness in the absolute embrace of shame.
As only you can say that.
True.
And again, let's go to some of the Howard Chaykin sayings. It's funny. One thing I remember, and I think Paul Levitt said it once, that first of all, the comic book industry has been dying for since almost the inception.
Right.
We've been dying since 1945, and in the 1970s when we were dying, you had said, "Well, I guess we're at the end of the beginning," you know, and that's literally what it looked like. I remember talking to John Romita Sr. or anyone that was around there. John said, "Well, the reason why we aged up Spider-Man was because we thought we were going to be out of business next year." He said there was no reason not to tell stories that age the characters. Why do you think he went from high school to college? We didn't think we'd be around. And the industry has lived through that time and time again. I mean, you've got the mid 1940s to the end of the 1940s. You didn't have the end of comics, but you had the end of superhero comics, and we started to move to romance and horror and everything. And then, as you were just saying, just with what happened with the Wortham trials, where the Comics Code Authority came in and started watering everything down, we had a resurgence, thankfully, in 1960 to 61. DC gets some credit for having the Justice League and some other books that started picking up steam. Marvel obviously had Stan, Jack, Steve, and everyone working on FF, Avengers, X-Men, Spider-Man, starting to renew the silver age of comics and the superheroes, going from Atlas comics and Western and horror books to actually superheroes again. We get into the 70s and the comics market's falling apart again. We start to revive in the 80s, and I will always say, and you'll disagree probably, you were part of that revival with American Flagg, just as Frank.
Let me know when I can step in and shut you up. The reality is that my generation, which came in the late 60s and early 70s, to a great extent, earnestly believed that we would outlive superhero comic books because superhero comic books were drawn by people our father's age. And all of us had come to comics by way of superhero comics, but for the most part, none of us cared about them or were reading them. It was a completely mistaken understanding of the material. We believed that we would be a reflowering of the sensibilities of EC, the way the Undergrounds had been an acknowledgement and reflowering of what Kurtzman had done at Mad. What we didn't understand was that concurrent with Stan exercising his grip on Marvel Comics being nothing more than a pastiche of Jack Kirby's work, that happened concurrent with the arrival of guys somewhat younger than we were, but not much, who were not required to bend to the wheel of what Stan and Jack had created, but rather could bend that wheel to their own needs. And that superhero comic books took on an entirely different look with the arrival of guys like Frank Miller, whose early work was basically no more than a synergy of Steve Ditko, Gil Kane, and Will Eisner. Bill Sienkiewicz, who was basically doing a Neil Adams knock. We forget that when Neil came in, Neil was reviled as a talent because he wasn't Murphy Anson. And that has to be borne in mind that things change. So when as a generation, we were blindsided by the idea that there could be another way of doing superhero comic books, and we never recovered. There were guys in my generation who learned how to do superhero books, but I never really did. Kaluta never really did. Brunner did, Howard the Duck and Doctor Strange, which are kind of outre superhero books. And Simonson got there, but Simonson's work is very odd in terms of its relationship to mainstream material. It wasn't until John Byrne comes along. John is a guy whose work is very cipherous. It lacks any actual specificity of point of view, so it's perfect. It's kind of like it's like Scully and Mulder on X-Files. They're not really characters as much as plot devices into which the audience pours its own belief system. That's a lot of what John did. I mean, Frank's work had more character, and Bill's work had an enormous amount of character. And then along comes Dennis Cowan, and all these guys who were introducing European and independent comics technique to mainstream material, and it sort of saved the business. But I never really was a part of that. By the time I became a working professional in my early 20s, I had no interest in doing superhero comic books. I wasn't good enough to do them by the standards they were set up, and by the time I did get good enough, I didn't give a fuck about it. So I mean, I do them because basically it's sometimes I have to eat, and sometimes I have to take work that isn't necessarily what I desperately want to do. Because I'm a working professional, I do the best I can with the work that's given to me. I don't believe that a corporate job or an independent job each deserve different commitments to craft and quality. They deserve the same. The work is the same, and I take that very seriously. Most of the people on the outside of comic books or in comic book journalism, if you will, who look at comics and rather sniffily regard mainstream comics as hack work, completely misunderstand and misread the amount of effort required to produce what is basically frivolous material that's awfully difficult to do well. Comics is not an easy thing to do right. It's always surprising to me when a guy who comes from outside of comics and does them well the first time out of the box. It's a very easily misunderstood and misinterpreted medium.
It is. It's a different medium, and you're right. People from outside the industry don't get that. They look at comics, they probably see it as a two-person act, and they think that it's easier than anything they're doing. When, like any other set of skills, you actually have to hone your craft to get there.
I mean,
Um,
comics are not storyboards. They're not movies on paper. They are a very specific language, specific in terms to the page, the material on a page. They're not newspaper strips, which are very different. I mean, newspaper strips and comic strips share the same techniques and tools, but their goals are entirely different. And the aspect ratio of the comic book page is set up and designed for a specific kind of narrative enterprise.
Well, speaking of the enterprise and speaking of your breaking in the comics, and before we talk about American Flagg, then you started in the 70s. You worked with Wally Wood, Gil Kane, Neil Adams, some of the people you mentioned, Neil. I don't think you brought up Gil yet, to bring up Wally. But growing up in New York City with your New York City origins and your connections to the comics and the industry at that time, when most creators had to be in New York to deliver their pages, especially artists, um, and this maybe goes up until when DC moved out west for one of the big two. How close do you think the association of comic characters to New York, and how important was it then? Because obviously, like I said, I mean, I guess we could say the last 15 years it was only important for editorial to be in New York, not as much anybody else. But what do you see as the difference? What do you see as the evolution? And how important was it back then?
Well, there weren't a lot of guys. I mean, the previous generation of mine. I mean, there. When I came along, we were the third generation. The first generation were the guys who were born in the 20s. Then there was a small mini generation of guys born in the late 30s, early 40s. Roy, Neil, and Steranko, and that crowd. But there was a very small group, and what separated them from the previous generation, besides the age, was their fandom. They came in as fans of the material, and my generation were also fan based. And except for Larry, Ralph, and Frank, Larry Hama, Ralph Reese, and Frank Brunner, everybody came from out of town. They're mostly from the Southeast. A couple of guys from the Southwest. Later on, there was the Detroit Mafia came in. But for the most part, I was anomalous in being a New York guy in the comic book business. Unlike a lot of these guys who were lifelines for each other in terms of their relationships to each other and to the business, but their social lives revolved around comics. Mine, I already had a social life. I'd been born and raised and lived in New York City, and I had friends in a real life. And so I didn't depend on comics as a collegial and fellowship circumstance. And I, again, don't have any real opinions one way or the other about the relationship of living and working in comic books in the 1970s to New York City. By the time I did American Flagg, I was working for a company in Chicago. At the time it was in Evanston, and then moved to the Loop. And my work went to them by way of Federal Express. My relationship with my letterer, for example, is that either I or my assistant would go down to the Port Authority bus terminal every Friday and hand pages to the driver with a $20 bill, who would then drive back to Pennsylvania and hand it to Ken at the other end and the Greyhound bus terminal in Reading, Pennsylvania. and go back and forth that way. That's how crude and primitive that relationship was. But I mean, frankly, when I came back to comics in the early aughts, I was delivering material by digital. I haven't delivered original since then. I haven't done pencil since the 1980s, for Christ's sake. When you hire me to do a job, you have a general idea what it's going to look like. You know, I'm a brand, you know, and that's the way it is, just like anybody else.
No, I'll agree with you there, and that's why I'm asking. You know, and when I brought up editorial in the up until last 15 years, I meant I don't even know how much. Obviously, editors affect the stories and are part of the stories when you're dealing with corporate characters. But just as far as writers and artists, like you said, I mean, you were writing stories that you were delivering to a company in Chicago, but you weren't in Chicago. Just like people who were working for Eclipse were probably still mostly in and outside the New York area. So my question, and I apologize, I wasn't clear, was how important do you think New York was to comics back then? Like, how did that evolution happen? Just
important in getting a job, maintaining a career.
like how it flavored the stories. I mean, Marvel had the characters with feet of clay. Obviously, when you did American Flagg, that was the future, so that was totally different. But I mean, you had a celebrated, fantastic graphic novel with Archie Goodwin. You worked with a lot of people. Just I didn't know if you had a feel if how that helped. I mean, Marvel more than DC, I guess, because instead of New York, DC had Metropolis and Gotham City.
That is as irrelevant and a bit of nonsense as you can possibly imagine. Who cares? That I mean, so Marvel characters take place in New York. It's not a real New York. I mean, you know, people don't talk to each other this way. I mean, who gives a? I mean, Nick, that's talk to people who read this who care about that crap. Don't talk to me about it, please.
All right, so we'll move the conversation to something else.
Building, the back Irving Forbush, please.
Come on, you didn't go to.
No, it's just ooey. It's utter junk.
You didn't go to the bullpen back in the day.
Look, I was a little boy. I was my favorite comic. Look, I discovered comics when I was 4. I taught myself to read from comics. I entered school reading on a 4th grade level because of comics. I loved superhero comic books, and then I discovered the Marvel stuff when I was 12, and I'm a total Marvel junkie. But by the time I became a working professional, I'd lost any and all interest in this material from an entertainment perspective. I didn't give a shit about it. I couldn't read this stuff. It's junk. You know, it was aimed at children, and I wasn't a child anymore. I wanted something else. You know, I was making my living in mainstream comics, but I was reading the underground. That's the comic stuff I read. And also, when I went to work with Gil Kane at the age of 18, he introduced me to an entirely new world. I was aware of Spanish comics by way of the Puerto Rican bodega that I grew up next to, because they had in Cinco Después Infinito and Danny Futuro, the Spanish comics, Mexican editions in black and white. But Gil was the one who turned me on to Pilote and Spirou. It's when I saw Giraud's first work on Blueberry, the guy who became Mobius. Jean-Claude Messier on Valerian. Bob Moon and Titania. You know, the Mortimer and Jacob stuff. This stuff just changed the way I thought about pictures and comics. I mean, in 1973, it was the first and only International Congress of Comic Book Talent, which was hosted at the Society of Illustrators. And we got to meet Giraud and Duryea and all these people, you know, Jean-Pierre Dionnet. And I was embarrassed by the fact that they were doing stuff that I cared about. We were doing shit. We were just doing this Cape mask crap. And I had other things I wanted to do, and I tried for most of the 1970s, despite the fact that my skill set wasn't up to it, to do better work in the service of more interesting shit. And that's one of the reasons why when I was thrown out of comics in the late 70s, early 80s, by the then editor in chief, I was perfectly happy to be away for a year and a half, 2 years. It was good, making my living elsewhere. And when First Comics, for some reason which I've never been able to figure out, felt confident enough to offer me enough money to get back on the saddle and get over the debts that I had accrued working for Byron Price, chasing the same dragon that I'm talking about right now, to find work to do other than superhero comics with the skill sets that I had, I'm very grateful for that. Flagg gave me an opportunity to develop work with my own point of view, and it taught me that I could write and draw my own stuff successfully and aggressively. But I never achieved any true commercial success with that material. I reached one reader for every 10 that Watchmen did, or that Frank did with Ronin, or with Dark Knight. The impact of Flagg was had on the talent pool, not the audience. The techniques and tropes and skill sets that I demonstrated in Flagg, that I introduced there, had become part of the language of comics. I mean, it is one of the underpinning architects of the business, but that never accrued to commercial success for me. Okay, so that's, I mean, I don't give a shit about where superhero comic books taking place in New York. I just don't care. And frankly, years and years ago, I realized that much of the depiction of urban environments in American comics was generic and pointless. And I made it my business as an adult and working professional. When I draw a city in a book that I've done, when I drew New York City, for example, in the Shadow for DC in the '80s, that's a real New York. I take that very seriously. To this day, I mean, I subscribe to the Leonard Starr perspective. Starr's great strip, Mary Perkins on Stage on Sundays, always began with an establishing shot of New York City. Nothing generic about it. When I look at Mad Men, for example, a television series that is lauded for its recreation of an era, I always think of Mad Men as being incredibly hermetic. It's like a play about New York in the 1970s or 60s and 70s. Every time that those characters stepped outside, that was Los Angeles light. It was never convincingly New York. And I feel that my work, I like specificity. I like a point of view. One of the things I teach when I lecture on comics is that the arbitrary nature of choice, size matters in terms of the size of the panel you choose to make and what you choose to draw in it. Being specific counts a great deal. That's the deal.
Well, I mean, look, you're talking about you have more influence on the talent pool. I mean,
oh, yeah.
Would we have Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips today if it wasn't for you? I'm sorry.
I don't know who we would have or won't have. I don't know. I mean, I've heard, for example, people for whom I've uttered contempt regarding me as an influence. And I have no idea where that comes from. I don't know, But, I mean, the fact is, I mean, all I want out of life is comfort and privacy. I'm not, I mean, I long ago gave up trying to make happy the institutionalized gatekeepers of mainstream comics fandom. I'm not that guy. I don't share the enthusiasms. I'm kind of aghast and appalled at colleagues of mine who are entertained by the same shit that they're drawing and writing, which is amazing to me. I just don't get it. I mean, how any grown man in their right mind can enjoy the adventures of a rich guy who had a bad day when he was 8. Just please. These are concepts and characters created by 15-year-old boys for other 15-year-old boys. And I'm not a 15-year-old boy, and I stopped being a 15-year-old boy when I was 16. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't like I was a big fan of this stuff when I was a teenager or an early adult. I like comics as a form, and my job in the years that I've been working in comics has been to find content to suit my interest in the form. That's what it's about for me.
Well, okay, so I'm going to jump around like I always do. So you talked a little bit about the
look at the Shadow stuff I've done for you.
Okay? Right.
I did an 8-page story and I did a 6-issue prequel to the work I did for DC.
Yeah.
There is nothing proximate in there at all. I mean, when I draw Moscow, when I draw London, that's real. I mean, that's using reference, that's creating an atmosphere, it's doing research, it's paying attention to detail, it's giving people maybe not what they even know they want, but what they're entitled to and they need. Okay.
Well, I mean, and that I know at least just from the first Shadow miniseries, because when you were writing and drawing the first 4 issues, which to me is one of the greatest stories of all time, one of the greatest comics of all time, I would be going to New York to Fred Greenberg Great Eastern Convention. And I saw New York. I saw the Port Authority. I saw where one of the Shadow's agents was tied to a post and gasoline thrown on him and burned alive. You've seen that stuff because you really did cover the city. You did make it real. You did bring that to comics, but and like I was saying, well, I mean, you whether you feel like you touched a larger audience or not, uh,
I know
whether you,
I know what my bank account looks like, so I know what my audience has been touched. Okay, I know that I had to leave comics for 15 years to work in television on junk, so that I could afford to be this old and not live on cat food and Social Security. Okay, I know that I could never have depended on comics to get myself into a position of economic comfort. Trust me. Okay.
well, you did leave comics for a while because you did Viper. I think you might have been on the Flash.
Endless
You did
work
Mutant
on
X.
stuff. I never worked on a show I'd watch.
You didn't want to be part of a club that would have you.
No, I'm perfectly happy belonging to a club that would have me, but I'd never work on a show I'd watch.
All right, that one threw me for a loop. Um, so what? I'll jump into something that hopefully is a safer topic. How
Is anything wrong with unsafety?
you have worked with some great creators. You worked with Archie Goodwin, where he was the writer, you were the artist. You've worked with Jose Garcia Lopez on Twilight. You've worked with Mark Guggenheim once told me at dinner that you're the only artist that he has to keep up with. You were the most professional artist he's ever worked with as far as being on time. I'm not saying that other artists aren't professional, but you were always the most on time artist. You always delivered on time. That he had to work to keep up with you. And then there are creators like Brian Michael Bendis that really wanted to work with you. You did uh, Avengers story arc with him. How, and obviously you write and draw your own stories. I mean, is there a question coming out of this? I mean, again, you say you're a cult figure. I guess I can understand where you're coming from, and I know you're saying where your bank account is, but how do you like the different processes? How about I ask that question?
Which process are you talking about? Writing or drawing?
Writing and drawing for yourself, writing for other creators, drawing for other creators. Do you feel the difference at all?
I mean, like I say, right now, I'm working on a book that I'm collaborating on with another writer. I'm working from his script. He's a writer I like working with, and his work is both easy and challenging at the same time. And also, I'm working right now on a script for the sequel to a crime book I did about 10 years ago, which I'll be writing and drawing. And the challenges are all different. I mean, I just did an hour's worth of lecture for Talent Talk about the paradigm of the 5-panel page, and how one reaches that 5-panel page, and what the 5-panel page means, the relationship of the page to time, the relationship of panels to the page, and I am delighted every day to be able to get up in the morning and apply my skill set to what other people have an enviable hobby. That said, that first day of those old Marvel seminars that I used to do was spent beating the hobbyism out of talent, because there are too many people who think that simply because you're doing something that you did as a kid, that the hobbiness follows you into your professional career. And I take very seriously the idea that the minute I take a corporate dollar, I'm a corporate cog. And my job is to deliver what the corporation needs. So I'm not being paid for the work I do. I'm being paid for the money that's earned by the sales of the product I'm creating. This may sound crass, but that's just I love the process of making comic books. I don't want to read them. I derive the same joy and pleasure from making them as I once did from reading them. I love the language, and I love seeing someone do something new. And there are occasional delights, not frequent, but occasional. And that's my story.
Well, I mean, look, looking at one of the books you're doing now, I mean, you've moved your entire library right now to Image Comics, and I think you've got a great relationship there, a great situation. I think that those guys fully respect your work, that they are pushing it well, and they're allowing you to do the books that you want to do. You've been able to do Hey Kids comics, which is definitely different and something more people should be reading. I think Hey Kids comics is one of the best books that's come out in the last few years, and hopefully from this interview, more people will pick it up.
Again, it's fighting for attention for an audience that doesn't care about that sort of stuff. I mean, I gave up, like I said, on institutional fandom when it received no attention whatsoever from any of the critics' choices or any of that stuff. Because I'm very proud of the work, and the problem is that for the most part, comic book people, comic book enthusiasts, are convinced by the Stanley that we're just a bunch of comic book loving guys and we do this for fun. You know, it's my job, it's my career, and I'm very grateful to have that career. But it's still every morning on my desk, you know. And the stories that I told in Hey Kids Comics in the first arc, the second arc is done. It'll be out. The first things will be out in May. Is about the struggle of making this stuff. What goes into the sausage before the sausage shows up on your shelf, and the real people involved, you know. And for all of that nicknaming crap that went on in Marvel in the '70s, there's a lot of bitterness of the previous generation, you know. And as a generation, my generation isn't particularly bitter because we went in knowing what to expect. And you know, and as I've said more than once, I'd love to be more loved and more commercially available, but I'm not capable or interested in bending my own will to produce work that is more fan service based. I just don't care about what fans care about. And I'm hoping to grab some of those people and drag them, perhaps kicking and screaming, into my sensibility and into my belief system. I've succeeded some places and failed in others. So that's really where it's at. I can't tell you how grateful I am that I've never had to do anything for a living that I didn't love. Think about that way. It's really cool. I get really tired of people putting hands to the backs of their hands to their heads. Woe is me, complaining about the struggle. You should be lucky and grateful that you get to do this for a living every day. It's fantastic. You know, I'm a happy guy.
It is fantastic. It is. It really is breathing rarefied air, and you know,
I've never had a job. You know, think about that.
well, it's a job, but it's a job you love. So it's
No,
it.
it's not. It's a career that has taken me, you know, into. I mean, just it's look. I've had an enviable life. I mean, I'm 70 years old, and I'm still dressed like a child, and I get to do what I want for a living every day. And what more could be? You know, it's fabulous.
No, it is fabulous. And look, I mean, again, obviously, I know where you're coming from when you say I understand where you're coming from. And I guess being a fan, I see it differently because obviously not being in your shoes, in my opinion, I see some of the other creators you've affected. You've obviously affected me as a fan. You're probably one of the biggest reasons I'm in this industry. We all have the books we love, and for me, the books of the early '80s, if I were to put together my four favorite series, it's American Flag, Shadow, You'll Laugh, Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Dark Knight Returns. Those
Wow.
were my four favorite series as a youngster, as a 13-year-old going to be 16-year-old. And by the time you did The Shadow, I have one friend who hates you for that first issue of The Shadow, and he and I have gotten into a few arguments. And I'm on the other side that thought what you did with the first issue of The Shadow was so brilliant and so engaging that it just really drew me in. I mean, again, I talked about this in the preamble, but your first issue of The Shadow showed the quote unquote present at the time, and it was the present at the time, where a character who disappeared for 40 years could actually reappear, and his agents would be around. and like you said, it's the real New York, and I'd been there, so I knew that was real. But you had an issue where everything was being set up, everything was around this one character, and you never saw the character until the last page. And basically, all he said was, "Hello, Margot." Can't even remember what else he said, but basically, you saw people's face drop, the few people that were still alive, and you took the mythos and you turned it. You know, you said he wasn't really Lamont Cranston. He took someone else. Someone else took his identity. He took someone else's identity. You made this. You made the Shadow actually have a real backstory. And if you look at the history of the Shadow outside of the pulp, you were the first person that made not only the Shadow really popular, because the Shadow had other runs. He had the Archie run, which was really horrendous, and I feel bad. It feels blasphemous, but that was Jerry Siegel and was terrible. And that's probably the meanest thing I'll ever say. But even the '70s series had 11 issues, and it had Wrightson, and it had it. I think, well, it obviously had Kaluta, and I think Wrightson did an issue or two. But when you did the Shadow in '86, I think it was 85, 80, no, 84, 85. You
No,
actually,
no, I was 85. I moved to California the day before I turned 35 in 1985, and
okay,
I started the book 2 weeks later. I'd written it already, but I started drawing the book 2 weeks later. And so it was published in the early 1980, early '86 rather.
okay.
Um, I mean, but the fact of the matter is, I, for the most part, I've tried to do the best work I possibly can in the service of material. And if the audience likes it, it does. I'm fine. If it doesn't, I'm good. I just I can't be bothered to get myself all worked up about you know who cares. I just don't really care that much. I mean, as I've said more than once, I'd love to be loved, but I'm not willing to work that hard at bending to the will of that love. Not happening.
No, you're willing to do the work that makes you happy, that you feel you should do, and you hand it in.
Yeah.
Who is one? Who are you worked with a lot of great artists? Who were some of your favorite artists to work with when you wrote for them?
No, well, obviously Jose Garcia Lopez was just an absolute joy to work with. I mean, in a true world of meritocracy, Jose Garcia Lopez would be Olympian, he'd be Odin. I mean, I loved working with him, and I've just finished a short piece featuring a renowned pulp character, which I can't name, which is going to be drawn by Eduardo Riso, and I'm really excited about that because I love Riso's work. The contemporary guys around whose work I really love. I love Garcia Lopez's stuff. I love Riso. I love Leon Yu's stuff. He's really good. I like a lot of guys. I just don't care enough about reading most of the stories because most of the stories are sort of self-reflective and meta about stuff I don't care about.
Fair enough. If you're nothing, if not matter of fact, then blunt.
All right, I got nothing else. It means I don't have to remember the truth for the morning. It means I already told it the night before.
Well, you started off. You mentioned earlier about you're doing the Marvel seminars. How did that start? I mean, that does feel like it's you giving back, whether or not you're paid for it.
Oh,
It
I am. I didn't do it for nothing. Not a lot though. I got a call from I got a call from Klaus Janson, and he asked me if I'd be interested in participating. And I jumped on it, and we did it for 6 years. We did 2 a year. When Klaus jumped ship and went to DC, I stuck it alone. Comically they would bring in more commercially successful talent than us, and to a great extent, what they said was by the standards of what we were laying out. I mean, the first day consisted of explaining time management and how not to be an amateur in a professional's business. The second was discussing the concept of narrative storytelling, and the third was to shape up and stop being such. And it was great. I had a great time. Very effective, very successful. I've recently unfriended somebody on Facebook who's in one of the early seminars because he's a political lunatic. But we'll see what develops.
I mean, you get the one plus about you do have the one plus about doing the Marvel seminars is that you get to be in New York and see the plays and have dinners at restaurants that you enjoy. I mean, I remember one time you came to Wizard World Philly right before you did a Marvel seminar. You were able to put the two together, and you and I went to Bank and Bourbon and had one of the best meals we've ever had, and that was an enjoyable evening.
Oh, look, I'm great dinner company, as you know. As I recall, I made you eat rare meat, which is I'm assuming you took it home and overcooked it, so it would be more edible for yourself later. But that's just
No, believe it or not, I took it home and I debated whether or not to just try and cook it a little bit to get some juices back out of it. And I said, this one I'm eating cold. And it was almost as good as eating it. The only thing missing from eating it cold was actually not having your company. It was really, really fun dinner. It was a great new restaurant. I mean, any city we go to, uh, you know the best places to grab grub. I mean, it's
well.
just amazing.
Next time you find yourself with that much meat left over, I have two suggestions. A, put it in an oven at 250 and leave it for an hour. Or
Okay.
B, strip it off the bone, chop it up, toss it with an equal amount of cooked potatoes cubed as well, and an onion is also cubed, and make a hash. I did that last night.
Nice.
I made a rib roast 2 weeks ago,
Yeah.
2 meals out of it, and the last piece ended up becoming hash last night. So that's the story.
You said Hey Kids Comics is going to be coming out in April or May.
Just delivered the solicitation copy for issue one of the second arc of Hey Kids Comics is called Profits and Loss. It's 6 issues. It's a bit more linear than the first arc, but just as bitter. And it starts in 1950 and ends in 1980, with a couple of touch bases from the 70s and from the early aughts. It's about the impact of the Comics Code Authority on comics and my generation, and I think you'll dig it. We'll be talking about it more as time progresses, but I'm very happy with this work. So stay with me, and again, thanks so much, Nick.
Yeah, no, look, we'll leave it with if the audience hasn't tried it out, it's an Image Comics book. The collection is out there. You can either you can ask your local retailer to order it. They are available for reorder if they don't have it already, or you can read it on Comixology. It is just a really, really fun series, and I highly recommend that in this world that we have where retailers are struggling, let your retailer know that you want to order it or order it from your favorite mail order company and just have them set it aside. It's one of the best, freshest comics that have been out there. And I remember I picked out the issues and I had read them. And I don't get to read the comics on a monthly basis like I used to. They sometimes pile up. I read them all at once. But when I saw you at Terrificon 2 August ago, the last Terrificon, I bought the collection from you, and it was really enjoyable just reading it all in one sitting.
Thanks, man. And speaking of retailers, support your retailer. These guys are struggling, and it's a
Yeah.
tough. It's hard times in old England here, folks. And I'm a great believer in supporting my retailers. I bought, for example, I bought the new EC Taschen book from my retailer because they deserve the sale. So go with God. All right.
Yeah, and Taschen's a great company. And the only other thing I'll say is, in addition to support all your retailers, do check out Howard's entire library. It is one of the most extensive libraries. This man, you can look at his creator-owned books. You can look at some of the books he's done for publishers. Almost everything is in print because the work is that fantastic. And again, if for whatever reason you can't find it, check it out on Comixology or Amazon Kindle. But if you can, get it from your local retailer because there is honestly nothing like holding the physical book in your hand. I still have the first Shadow trade paperback, even though I reprinted it and I was very fortunate. One of the greatest honors I ever had was reprinting that. I have the original trade paperback because there's nothing like having the original. So
And while you're at it, check out Substack. I've been publishing essays on Substack for the past couple of months. It's free. Sign up with the email, SUBSTACK. Go there and find me. You'll like what you find. It'll probably piss some of you off, but some of it will be enlightening. Thanks again.
Kyle will put that in here so that fans know as this runs on the channel. I want to thank Howard Chaykin not only for this interview, but this coming weekend, he is going to appear at our convention, our online convention. The link will be down in the description. We'll also be launching the comic book shopping experience come Tuesday, the 19th. I want to thank everybody here who got a chance to watch this. Please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and thank you everyone, but especially thank you, Howard. Again, another enjoyable time talking to you, even if I didn't agree with you always.
Of course. What's too much agreement spoils the chat. Have a great day. Stay warm and dry and don't do anything stupid. If you do, let me know because the video rights will be worth a fortune.